Welcome back to The Spoken Word. I'm Travis, and I'm your host. In this episode, I want to discuss a rather strange ritual that also kaphars in the Old Testament. We learned last time that kaphar is the verb that describes what it is that Old Testament sacrifices do, like on the Day of Atonement. But this particular ritual involves money being paid to the tabernacle ministry after a census is taken of the Israelites. Many translations call that money a ransom payment. Most translations go on and say that this payment atones for the lives of the Israelites. I want to address this passage because we learned last time that sacrifices in the Old Testament were not at all about paying penalties or fines like we often imagine. This ritual seems to leave that possibility open at first glance. So let's dive in and talk about this so-called ransom. This passage is not actually in Leviticus like you'd expect. It shows up in the book of Exodus, chapter 30, verses 11 through 16. Moses was up on Mount Sinai in this passage, building instructions for the tabernacle and all of its equipment. In that context, Moses is told this: "The Lord spoke to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to register them, each of the men must pay a ransom for his life to the Lord as they are registered. Then no plague will come on them as they are registered. Everyone who is registered must pay half a shekel, according to the sanctuary shekel, 20 gerahs to the shekel. This half shekel is a contribution to the Lord. Each man who is registered 20 years old or more must give this contribution to the Lord. The wealthy may not give more, and the poor may not give less than half a shekel when giving the contribution to the Lord to atone for your lives. Take the atonement price from the Israelites and use it for the service of the tent of meeting. It will serve as a reminder for the Israelites before the Lord to atone for your lives." At first glance, there seems to be some very strange logic at play here. You take a census, and suddenly every person needs to pay a ransom. So that means they became a captive somehow? Well, to who? Someone, I don't know, maybe an angry God? And if you don't ransom yourself with this money, he'll send a plague. But if you do bring the money, your life gets atoned for. So that makes it sound like taking a census itself is some kind of sin, and you needed to pay a ransom price to get free of the consequences. Oh, and by the way, it'll be a reminder for the Israelites, or for God, depending on your translation. Talk about confusing. All of this nonsense is really the fault of our translations. Let's break it down. First, was taking a census a sin? The money atones, or in Hebrew, kaphars, for their lives, so it must be a sin, right? No, the Old Testament never says it was a sin to take a census. In fact, God himself ordered Moses to take a census in Numbers chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. That's part of why that part of the Torah is called the book of, Numbers. Here's the passage. God says, "Take a census of the entire Israelite community by their clans and their ancestral families, counting the names of every male one by one. You and Aaron are to register those who are 20 years old or more by their military divisions, everyone who can serve in Israel's army." Not only does God order a census himself here, he also says in our Exodus passage that we just read that God assumes censuses will be taken. He said, when you take a census, go and do all this stuff with the money, not if. Taking a census was never said to be a sin. Also, if it were a sin, we just learned from Leviticus that there are only certain sin offerings that are acceptable for dealing with what happens when you break God's laws. If you were a priest, you had to bring a bull for a sin offering. If you were a commoner, you could bring a lamb or a young goat. If you were poor, you could bring 2 doves or 2 pigeons. And if you were so poor that you couldn't even do that, you could bring flour. You can read all about those different sacrifices in Leviticus 4 and 5. If you read through those passages, you will find that money was never the substance of a sin offering. Since money was never a sin offering, that is another reason to conclude that this whole ritual in Exodus was not at all connected to sin. since money was never a sin offering. That's another reason to conclude that this whole ritual in Exodus had nothing to do with sin. Also, from what we've seen in Leviticus so far, we understand that sin offerings have to be presented before God by a priest before they can kaphar for anything. The high priest isn't even mentioned here. That's a third reason to conclude this wasn't a sin offering in any shape, form, or fashion. So then, what is the deal with the language of atoning or kapharing for their lives then? Doesn't that sound like some kind of general covering for all of the sins of the people, atoning for their lives? Well, no, that's the domain of the Day of Atonement, right? We have a whole passage about that in Leviticus. The solution to generalized sin was the Day of Atonement, not going and taking a census and then paying God some money. Again, this is one of those places where our translations hamstring us. Remember that kaphar, or what we often translate as atone, is a verb with a wide range of meaning that generally has this idea of doing something so as to dramatically change people, things, or maybe even situations. Note its usage here. Participation in the ritual kaphars for the lives of the Israelites. It changes the situation for their lives. That is to say, for the benefit or for the sake of their lives. The ritual doesn't change their lives itself. This is another one of those times that the verb kaphar is used without a direct object, just like we discussed last time. It describes for the sake of what or whom kapharing is being done, but it doesn't say what exactly is itself being kaphared. To get at that, we have to infer what is being kaphared based on context alone. In this context, what needs changing is the threat of plague. The people didn't sin, and God is not mad. So that leaves us with this looming threat of death as the one thing that needs to be modified. If you can kaphar that, you can change the threat of death, and that would certainly be for the benefit of their lives. Maybe a better way to render kaphar in this passage would be something like protect. Maybe that's not the most precise translation, but that is the effect that kaphar is having more so than atoning. For what it's worth, the Good News Translation, or the GNT, actually went with this idea, so it's not really that far-fetched. It's much better to let kaphar have many simultaneous meanings. It basically covers, and that can have a wide range of meanings. Maybe it can modify something, it can protect something, it can avert disaster. Covering can cleanse things, it can purify things, and probably even more that I haven't thought of. It's just ridiculous to translate such a flexible and rich word like kaphar exclusively as atone or make atonement, especially when it makes a passage like this one incoherent. But you may ask yourself, if no sin is involved, then why on earth would God bring a plague if the money wasn't brought? Well, we just saw from that census in Numbers 1 that God ordered a census for the purpose of getting a head count of military-age men who could serve Israel's army. It said that they were supposed to count everyone who was 20 years or older, and that the purpose was to see who could serve in Israel's army. That number of 20 years or more, remember, even appears in our Exodus passage. God says, when you take a census, all of these men who are 20 years old or more, that's who should pay this price. So we have this general idea of probably this Exodus passage is getting at taking a census for military conscription purposes. And that makes sense because in the ancient world, that was the most common reason for a census. If you wanted to go to war, you needed to know how many soldiers you had. With that background, this passage makes a lot more sense. Israel's strength was God. If you counted your troops and you didn't remember that God was your strength, and that in order to keep him in covenant relationship with Israel, you needed to support the Levitical ministry that itself is the very means of maintaining that relationship, you would get reminded really quick where Israel's power came from when your army starts dying off of a plague. God is what would win battles for Israel, not numbers. That explains what the bit at the end of the passage is all about, where it says that the offering will be a reminder for the Israelites. Some translations make it seem like it's a reminder for God, but that's probably not right on the basis that God really does not have a habit of forgetting things. It makes a lot more sense if it's about reminding the whole army of Israel what their most important asset is. The point was that an Israelite should never go to war without attending to God's covenant and keeping his space in working order. All right, one more thing. What's the deal with the language of the money being a ransom? Well, the word that is variously translated as ransom or atonement money and so forth in this passage is the Hebrew word kopher. So just like we did with kaphar, let's look at how this word is used outside of this context so that we can maybe get a better fix on its definition and how it works within the text. So first, just like kaphar actually, kopher makes its very first appearance in Genesis 6, verse 14. In the passage, Noah is told to make an ark of wood and to cover it with pitch. We said last time that he was supposed to kaphar it with pitch. What it really says is that he is supposed to kaphar it with kopher. So kopher means pitch? Yes. Hold on to that thought. Here's another use from the book of Numbers, chapter 35, verses 30 through 31. This is talking about what to do if someone is a murderer. It says, if anyone kills a person, the murderer is to be put to death based on the word of witnesses. But no one is to be put to death based on the testimony of one witness. You are not to accept a kopher for the life of someone who is guilty of murder. He must be put to death. Here, a kopher is something offered to save one's life. It doesn't say that it has to be money. The murderer might just as well offer you a goat or oceanfront property or, I don't know, his firstborn daughter or something as a kopher. But the law says that no matter what it is, don't accept it. Never accept a kopher for someone who has murdered someone. So a kopher here is a means of saving one's life from the threat of death. Here's another use of kopher in Exodus 21, verses 29 through 30. This little law is about what to do if you have a bull and it kills someone. It says, if, however, the bull has had the habit of goring and the owner has been warned but has not kept it pinned up and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned and its owner is also to be put to death. However, if a kopher is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. So here again, we have someone under the threat of death due to their own negligence. And instead of executing this death penalty, the injured party can instead accept a kopher. And that kopher can be delivered to save or redeem one's life from the threat of death. Here's one last usage of kopher from Amos 5:12. This is from a prophet who is talking about the unjust rulers and priesthood and so forth in Israel at the time. He says this, for I know your crimes are many and your sins are innumerable. They oppress the righteous, take a kopher, and deprive the poor of justice at the city gates. So here, kophers have this connotation of being like a bribe. They are a means that someone can use to escape justice and not suffer the consequences of their own actions. So, in a way, they are still about saving a person from judgment, but it just has a negative connotation in this context. So then, what does pitch, reparations to prevent death, bribes to avoid punishment, and our shekel for the tabernacle have to do with each other? What do they have in common? Well, all of them are a means of saving life from a threat, especially when that threat is death. If it were not for the pitch that was put on the ark, everyone would have drowned. If you were the person who owned a bull who had killed someone and a kopher was allowed to be given, you could give that to save your life. If you had done something wrong, you could use a kopher as a bribe in this unjust legal system to save your life. That is the central point of all of it. All of them are a means of saving your life from a threat. It could be pitch, it could be money, it could be a snow cone for all we know. Kopher is a word that designates a purpose of something, not the form of something. Hence, Anything from pitch on the ark to money to a ticket to Disneyland could be a kopher given the right circumstances. The point is that while we often translate it exclusively as ransom, using a kopher doesn't require a hostage situation. It simply is a means used to save a life under threat, especially when the threat is death. Here, after you take the census, you are indeed under threat of death by plague. So kopher is a very apt word to use to describe the half shekel that is given in our Exodus passage. But since there are no hostages in view here, ransom is kind of a silly way to translate kopher here. That is doubly so when the so-called ransom doesn't even ransom. Well, what do I mean by that? Ransom is something that you give, that's a noun, to ransom someone, that is a verb, to set them free from imprisonment or what have you. The idea of ransoming someone as a verb in Hebrew is the word padah. As we already said, though, the money in this passage kaphars. It doesn't padah. So the fact that the ransom doesn't even ransom makes it all the more silly to translate kopher as ransom in this passage. God is not taking anyone hostage here. Okay, so that has been a lot. So let's give everyone's brains a break and think about what we have learned here. I know that everything I've said so far may seem to some of you like a bunch of semantics, but getting this passage right actually has New Testament implications. People read this ransom money account, then they make it to the New Testament and read Jesus' statement that he would give his life as a ransom for many in places like Mark 10:45, and people connect the dots and conclude that the cross was a transactional mechanism for paying off some kind of debt, either to God or to the devil. However, this ransom in Exodus is not a good parallel for Jesus' comment about being a ransom in Mark 10:45. First, like we already said, despite the offering being called a ransom in our translations, we already said that it doesn't even ransom anything. The kopher does not padah. So in effect, it's not even a ransom. Ransoms are only ransoms when they ransom, and this one doesn't. That makes it really difficult to make this passage a parallel with Jesus' statement when you consider Jesus' words in the broader context of all the other stuff he said about freeing captives, dethroning evil powers, and all that kind of language. Jesus was saying here that he would indeed be a ransom in every sense of the word, since he would actually ransom people from oppressive powers. That is not at all what this Exodus ritual was about. So I doubt that's what Jesus had in mind. Second, as we already said, this kopher was not a sacrifice for sin. We know the ransom in Exodus has nothing to do with, quote, paying for sin. We know for certain that Jesus died to deal with sin and oppressive, enslaving powers. So it would be really weird for him to allude to this passage where neither sin nor malevolent powers are being dealt with in any way. Remember that never once in the entire Old Testament can sin be paid for. It simply wasn't viewed as a problem that could be remedied with a transaction. In fact, like we saw earlier, we even have specific commands to not accept a kopher for certain sins like murder. In cases where a kopher could do something, sin wasn't the issue. As in the case we saw of a bull goring someone, the solution didn't demand a sin offering. It was a injustice amongst and within the Israelite community, but it wasn't called sin. So a kopher can be a means of correcting accidental injustices among the Israelites, but a kopher is never used to deal with sin. In fact, the word kopher doesn't even appear in the entire book of Leviticus. Why? Money or some other means of reparation couldn't cleanse anything, and cleansing was what sin needed. Money or some other kind of currency exchange simply was not the solution for sin. Remember, Leviticus has taught us that sin, whatever it is, has to be purged with the power of life. It never says that sin can be paid for like some abstract cosmic debt. It treats sin like a concrete, substantive, though invisible, thing. You can carry sin. You can cleanse sin. You can remove sin. It gets on people and it gets on stuff. It pollutes the tabernacle, it pollutes the altar, and it even pollutes the land sometimes. So whatever it is that the Old Testament means by sin, it isn't limited to an abstract idea like a legal misdemeanor. Because we think of sin through a westernized Greco-Roman or medieval lens, rather than through the lens of the Bible itself, it is us who think of sin as an abstract debt that would require payment to resolve. The ancient Israelites simply did not think in those terms. So that's another strike against why I don't think Jesus had this passage in mind when he said he'd give his life as a ransom. A Jew of his day would probably not have connected his words to this passage. So neither should we. But Jesus still said he'd be a ransom. So what did he mean? Well, first, let's explore how people often read it. What does a ransom even mean? According to Merriam-Webster, ransom, as a noun, is a consideration paid or demanded for the release of someone or something from captivity. Because of that, when people read passages like Mark 10:45 in isolation, most people get a logic that goes something like this. If Jesus said he would die as a ransom, and a ransom is payment necessary to release someone from captivity, then Jesus must have paid a debt for us. And since Jesus had to pay for us due to sins, sins must accrue a debt since he paid it. And since Jesus' form of payment was death, the form of the debt must be death. And since Jesus' form of payment was death on the cross, the currency needed to pay the debt must have been death and bloodshed. So, working backwards, if Jesus, who owed no debt because he never sinned, paid the cosmic bank anyway by dying, since he paid infinitely more than he owed, he would be able to pay off anyone's debt that he wished. Voila. You can definitely see how people get this kind of logic. Indeed, it was my logic for a long time. And if you go and dig around in a lot of westernized theology, this is, in essence, how things go. But here's the problem. What happens when you start putting meat on the bones of this idea? If Jesus' death was a currency exchange kind of ransom, who's he going to pay? Who owned the bank? God? He is God. God paying God to satisfy God's need to have an arbitrary debt paid is a masterclass in absurdity. Is he going to pay the devil? No. Since when would God have to bow to some ransom that is demanded by Satan? You can see that this kind of idea breaks down really fast. The Bible should be interpreted literally, except when doing so would make it absurd. Jesus literally paying something or someone by his death is absurd. So now what do we do? First, let's appreciate that this was actually the least common way that Jesus spoke of himself. This idea of being a ransom is used exactly twice in the entire New Testament. One time by Jesus, which is recorded in both Mark 10:45 and Matthew 20:28, and once by Paul in a personal letter to Timothy in 1 Timothy 2:6. So we have 3 appearances, 2 of which are duplicates, so only 2 real uses of this term. This idea of ransom has to be read within the context of everything else Jesus and the apostles said, and it has to be read within their cultural context. To that point, the idea that Jesus paid off a cosmic debt contradicts many themes of Jesus' own parables. Remember the story of the merciful king in Matthew 18? A man owed the king a crushing debt. The man begged for more time. And what happened? Some other guy showed up and paid the debt for him. Wait, what? That's not in your Bible? Oh, yeah, that's right. The king had mercy on the man and he forgave the man's debt. Do you know what forgiven means? It means nullified, voided, made non existent. If you forgive debt, the debt is voided, not paid. By definition, forgiving debt is not paying it. When Jesus was given an opportunity to say that a third party will show up and pay the debt that we all owe, Jesus didn't say that. The parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15 is another such example. The son defies his father, leaves to a foreign land, goes broke, and becomes a worthless version of his former self, and is left feeding pigs for a swineherder. In the midst of his suffering, his older brother shows up and pays off his debt to the swineherder. Oh, that part of the story is not in your Bible either? Oh, yeah, that's right. The son goes back home, practicing an I'm sorry speech, and his father forgives him and throws a party without even listening to all of his speech. There are probably more examples that could be given, but these two will suffice. If we are to primarily understand Jesus' death as a ransom payment, like most of us probably do in some way or another, why do none of Jesus' parables include anyone doing some literal ransoming with a currency exchange? Why don't we see a Kopher that padas? I think the question answers itself. Jesus was never going to be a literal ransom in the sense of a currency exchange. He didn't mean he was going to literally go and pay someone. He didn't mean that there was even some abstract cosmic debt out there to be paid. Remember, Jesus Christ died for sin and he died for sinners. He was trying to solve sin, a problem defined in the Old Testament. And there, we have already seen that sin is simply not a problem that can be paid for. When we remove Jesus from the Jewish context in which he lived and spoke within, we oftentimes will miss his meaning because we impose new, pagan frameworks onto his words and give them new meanings that he would have never had in mind. We must read Jesus as people who are washed with the Old Testament, not as a bunch of pagan Europeans. When we read metaphors like this one, or Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 6 and 7, that we were, quote, bought with a price, as forensic descriptions, like a Westerner might put them, rather than as the metaphors that they are, we completely miss their meaning. To understand the solution to sin that Jesus is proposing by saying that he will give his life as a ransom, we need to understand the problem he is addressing. If the problem is that we owe God or the devil or something else a debt, then we might rightly interpret Jesus' solution as a way to pay that debt. And that is probably how many of us read this. But if the problem as Jesus sees it is that we are oppressed by a malevolent entity and we are stained with sin, then Jesus could be saying that he would personally be the very means of saving us from that entity and removing our stain from us. He would personally be the means of saving us from the threat of death, which is right in line with our Old Testament informed sense of a Kopher. In fact, Jesus is probably using this very idea because he uses the Greek form of what the Septuagint translates Kopher as. So Jesus is using the language of a Kopher here in all of the breadth that a Hebrew-speaking person would have known it in the Old Testament. Jesus used this language to describe his purpose of saving lives without explaining too much about how exactly he would accomplish his purpose. As strange as it is for many of us to think about, remember that Jesus always had intelligent, evil agents listening in on his every conversation. So he couldn't be too obvious about what he was doing. They were part of the plan, and they needed to act in a certain way for it to be accomplished. Remember, Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 2:8, none of the rulers of this age knew the wisdom of God, because if they had known it, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. Rulers in this passage is one of Paul's shorthand titles for malevolent spiritual forces. He was saying that they did not have a clue about what Jesus was doing or why. We even see this when Jesus encounters demons. They speculate about why he is here. They know who he is, but they don't know what on earth he's doing. Jesus was cryptic about how he would achieve his goal, at least in part, so that those agents wouldn't catch on and would go through with killing him, the very thing he wanted, so he could deliver their death blow. When Jesus said he'd be a ransom, he suggested that he had the purpose of setting captives free. He didn't say what form his ransom would take. Imagine this. Let's say that you find yourself being held hostage at the hands of a bunch of terrorists. On the news in a press conference, the head of special forces comes up to the podium and says that a ransom will be delivered for you. The terrorists who are watching the television decide that they can relax, expecting a large sum of money to be delivered to release you from their grasp. That night, though, you're woken up from your sleep to the roar of helicopter rotors. You hear a bang in the distance as SEAL Team 6 breaches the door, kicks it in, and takes out all the bad guys. They come into your cell, untie you, load you on the helicopter, and whisk you away to safety. Wouldn't that be a ransom in every sense? Of course it would be. It just wouldn't be the form of ransom that the bad guys wanted or expected. I suspect that Jesus' ransom is more analogous to this kind of hostage rescue story than we realize. Check out Hosea 13:14. In it, Hosea is speaking the words of God, and he says this: I will ransom them from the power of Sheol, that is the underworld. I will redeem them from death. Death, where are your barbs? Sheol, where is your sting? Compassion is hidden from my eyes. So through the eyes of Hosea the prophet, we see God here mocking death and Sheol, freeing his people from their clutches, showing no mercy while doing so. He ransoms people, but he didn't do it with a currency exchange. Hosea envisioned God in Sheol on a hostage rescue mission, liberating his people by force in a cosmic exodus. Something like this passage could very well be the inspiration for the image that Jesus was evoking with his words that he would be a ransom. He may have also been evoking imagery from another famous rescue mission in the Old Testament, the Exodus, the time that God ransomed Israel from Egypt. That would have been the big ransom story that would have been ringing in a Jew's mind. If you recall, God did that little bit of ransoming by force as well, not through payment. Instead, he brought Israel out with a strong arm. God did not bribe Pharaoh or pay off the dark powers behind Pharaoh. Indeed, before the 10th plague, God himself said, I am Yahweh, and I will execute judgment against the Elohim of Egypt. Maybe there's a reason that Jesus chose deliberately to die on Passover rather than the Day of Atonement. Passover was the very day that the first Exodus started, as noted by scholars like N.T. Wright. So maybe he was trying to tell us something. Both in the Hosea passage that we read and in the Exodus itself, we can see that Yahweh does not negotiate with terrorists. He doesn't play by their rules. He doesn't pay them off with some abstract cosmic currency. He knocks the door down and he saves his people. If that image doesn't match up with the meek and mild Jesus that we're all used to in church, I suggest that we should go and read one of Jesus' parables in Luke 19:12-27. In the parable, a nobleman leaves for a far country to be crowned king. In his absence, a rebellion ensues, and the rebel leaders conspire against him. Some of his subjects remain faithful, though. When the newly crowned king returns, the faithful servants are rewarded, and he has the rebel leaders brought in before him and cut down in his presence. Jesus is a great friend, but he is an absolutely dreadful enemy. Even the demons shook in the presence of Jesus and begged for their lives because they knew they were in the presence of a God slayer. Go read the end of Psalm 82, 6-7 if you don't believe me. In that psalm, God sentences the immortal sons of Elohim who have rebelled against him to die like men with only a word. Remember how Jesus said that the gates of hell wouldn't hold back his kingdom? I think it's probably because he knocked the door down himself. He didn't play nice between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. When he was alive again, Jesus said that, quote, all power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. That implies that he gained something that he didn't have beforehand. It was given to him. Real progress towards saving humanity had been made between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. Peter said that Jesus has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God with angels, authorities, and powers subject to him. That was new. Jesus himself said, I was dead, but look, I am alive forever and ever, and I hold the keys of death and Hades. That was also new. Satan previously held the power of death, according to Hebrews chapter 2, verses 14 through 15. The writer says this, Now, since the children have flesh and blood in common, Jesus also shared in these, so that through his death he might destroy the one holding the power of death, that is, the devil, and free those who were held in slavery all their lives by the fear of death. Jesus won something when he was in the grave. He was indeed a ransom, but in the God-slaying, tyrant-crushing, death-breaking, Sheol-raiding ways of the Yahweh of the Exodus and of Hosea's vision. Jesus' ransom is liberating, not legal. He is a cure, not a currency. He frees us from sin, death, and dark powers. All of those are very strong New Testament themes. He is not some payment for an abstract and arbitrary cosmic debt that we have. That is never a New Testament theme. Jesus is the Passover lamb that protects us from the destroyer, and he is the scapegoat that carries our sins away. He is the water of the Red Sea that crushes our pursuers, and he is the pillar of fire that guides us to the promised land. He is the high priest, and he is the sacrifice itself. He is the fire of Sinai, and he is the still small voice. He is the ransomer and the ransom itself. He is the Lord of heaven's armies, and he is the Lamb that was slain. He is the agent, and he is the means. He is the Alpha. He is the Omega. He is God. He is not the petty tyrant just waiting to throw rocks at you when you mess up. That is Satan. Let's not get our heroes and our villains confused here. To come full circle on this whole discussion about what sacrifices did and how we should think about Jesus by extension, you remember that song that I sang really poorly in our first Leviticus episode? It said, on that cross, as Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. After all this review, maybe we can see that that's not the most biblical picture of what happened at Golgotha. Maybe this is better. On that cross, as Jesus died, the scourge of sin was nullified. Or perhaps, on that cross, as Jesus died, Satan's realm was vandalized. Now, those ideas are biblical. Here's Paul. Jesus erased the certificate of debt with its obligations that stood against us and opposed to us, and has taken it away by nailing it to the cross. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and disgraced them publicly. The Father triumphed over them in Jesus. That's from Colossians 2:14 through 15. Paul, in classic Jewish form, makes a point by saying the same thing three ways. Jesus erasing the so-called certificate of debt, disarming and disgracing the rulers and authorities, and the Father triumphing over them through Jesus are all ways of saying the same thing. On the hill of Golgotha, at the place of the skull, Yahweh went to war, and he won. That certificate of debt language, that comes from a single Greek word that in Roman times often referred to a document that said that a person was a debtor. Debt back then made you a slave to the one that you owed. They owned you. Since the New Testament makes it clear that we were enslaved to Satan and sin, that is who held this certificate. Satan, the accuser, owned us. He had every right to us. We had joined his rebellion. As the Gospels put it, we were under the tyranny of the devil. He was against us, but God was for us. Jesus took that certificate and shredded Satan's right of ownership and publicly disgraced the dark rulers and authorities that held the power of death. If anyone felt wrath on Good Friday, it was Satan when Jesus showed up in his kingdom and kicked him right off his throne. Satan really thought that he had a crack at killing God by crucifying Jesus. He is cunning, but he is not all-knowing. And Jesus, on the most daring hostage rescue operation in history, outwitted him. If Satan knew that the death of Jesus would be the thing that brought him down, he wouldn't have done it. Remember what we just read from Paul. None of the rulers of this age knew the wisdom of God, because if they had known it, they would have not crucified the Lord of glory. They thought they could kill God and keep us forever. Instead, God somehow outmaneuvered them and freed us from Satan's domain in the ultimate exodus. Even the author of Hebrews echoes this exodus language in chapters 3, 4, and 12 of the letter to the Hebrews, identifying us, the church, those in Christ, with the wilderness generation of the Israelites. Like them, we have been delivered from an enslaving, malevolent power. We are being given a new covenant, and we are heading to inherit a promised land, crushing the forces of darkness on the way. We are even being led by a guy who is named none other than Yeshua, a form of none other than Joshua. Since God himself chose the name Jesus and had it passed on to Mary by the angel Gabriel himself, that had to be deliberate. Now, that kind of an epic story is incredible. That is good news that doesn't need to be explained. Maybe we can see now why Paul said things like this. For I am persuaded that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Jesus Christ our Lord. What God has decreed, no one can contradict. No power in heaven, hell, or anywhere in between. And he has decreed you, dear listener, he has decreed you free. He has ransomed you from the kingdom of darkness by force, just like he went to Egypt and ransomed his people, Israel, by force. To quote the Lord himself, if the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. What will you do with his great ransom? As always, thank you so much for listening, my friends. I appreciate every single one of you, and I hope that this is beneficial. But until next time, go in the peace of God.